Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on tribal studies in India. So today we are going to discuss understanding the tribes in India with respect to our central discussion on tribal economy. We will understand how tribal economy operates, how it has been functioning traditionally and how it has transformed with modernization over decades and centuries through exposure to non-tribal institutions, non-tribal, economy and the way economy functions outside the tribal cosmos or the tribal ecosystem. Now, economic transformation of tribal societies has been shaped through historical as well as contemporary forces. A lot of external determinants that are non-tribal, that are extra or outside of the tribal ecosystem have gone on to change the tribal economy. Before colonial interventions, tribal economies functioned independently. Tribal economy was by and large an autonomous system. The state often positions economic transformation as a progress. So, whenever there is a new economic prism or a new economic policy or experiment imposed on the tribal systems, the state, national bodies, actually the policy making bodies actually look at these transformations in terms of progress or something good they are doing to the tribal groups. However, the consequences for tribals have largely been negative as a result of such outside or external interventions. While some of the policies made by the state on the tribals aim at integrating the tribals into the broader economy, they frequently also impose external economic systems which disregard the indigenous knowledge and practices. Prior to colonial interventions, tribal economies functioned on subsistence agriculture and barter systems, which fostered a sense of self-sufficiency, and so these tribal groups, like I was saying, be it a clan or a village as a unit, would by and large be autonomous in nature. Communal land ownership ensured equitable resource distribution, which limited the class divisions. The people within a given group were, having a symmetrical access to resources. Now, what happens is that with colonial interference, we see that there is forced, inclusion of the tribals in market economies. So, within the larger scheme of market, these smaller autonomous, tribal systems are included without much of their consent or consultation, which weakens their traditional institutions, and these colonial interferences actually go on to create a dependency on external trade and state controlled policies. So, now the tribal groups are tied to market economies, to larger economic systems, but they are not fair stakeholders or equal stakeholders within that system. They merely become dependent on external trade. This in a way takes away the agency of the tribal groups. Introduction of the concept of private land ownership created class differences. And we see that post-colonial policies continue these trends even beyond the legacy of colonial rule. The post-colonial policies, the post-colonial bodies that are dealing with tribal economy tend to just maintain the colonial perspective, and they promote commercial farming, which lead to the loss of autonomy and increasing reliance and dependence on external economic forces. So, industrial and commercial agricultural expansion lead to large scale land dispossession of the tribal groups, which intensifies economic vulnerabilities of the tribal people. Protective land laws fail in execution, allowing systematic alienation of tribal lands. Development projects often displace the tribal populations without providing them adequate alternate rehabilitation, thereby reinforcing cycles of poverty and marginalization. The commodification of the tribal lands through external intervention has led to severe economic and structural consequences. So, over a period of time, we see that these structural changes were furthered by the interaction that developed between the tribals and the people who come from outside of the tribal areas, who are essentially non-tribals. And this dialogue, this interaction caused significant changes in land holding patterns as well as in the tribal economy itself. Shifting cultivation, which has been practiced by many tribal communities, was systematically discouraged by the state, and it was being replaced by settled agriculture, which was promoted by the state. So, the state has traditionally not been in favor of shifting cultivation, which is a common practice among the tribal groups. Rather, the state would emphasize on settled agriculture. The consequence of this shift in agricultural pattern, is land fragmentation, soil degradation, as well as declining agricultural productivity. The tribals across the country were often forced to adopt unfamiliar farming techniques without adequate support in terms of finance, technology and resources being provided to them by the government, which further make them vulnerable to food insecurity and economic instability. So, what happens is that their traditional farming methods are taken away from them and new methods are introduced. However, the infrastructure or the technology, the resources required to support that kind of unfamiliar farming are not provided to the tribals. So, that actually destabilizes the tribal economy. The shift to commercial cash crops increased the tribal incomes, but at the same time it also made them dependent on the volatile global markets. So, for a long time the autonomous small scale the microcosmic economic stability that they used to enjoy, the economic stability within their own tribal microcosm which they used to enjoy, was actually replaced by their dependency on a volatile global market. So, many tribals as a result lost their land to corporations, which reduced them to low paid laborers. So, from agro-based economy or forest based economy, these tribals are reduced to low paid laborers who are working for the corporations or working in factories. In India, the growing cases of exploitation of the tribal people, their loss of land and their indebtedness, their perpetual endless indebtedness have all significantly contributed towards transforming the tribals from peasants, from agriculturalists into laborers, low paid wage workers. Government agricultural schemes often fail to consider or understand the socio-economic realities of the tribal farmers, and loan-based initiatives lead to further triggering their debt circles. So, when a loan is given to them in the form of initiative or to encourage a kind of startup, it actually triggers a debt cycle rather than promoting sustainable farming. Access to irrigation, modern equipment and training is uneven, and it further reinforces disparities, thereby disadvantaging the tribal population and the tribal economy. So, we have to understand at this point that the tribals are largely dependent on the forest economy. However, colonial and post-colonial rule have significantly changed their relationship with forests through curbing and limiting their rights to forest and forest producers. Tribals have traditionally depended on forests for various reasons: water for agricultural purposes, fodder to feed the cattle, bamboo as well as other wood for constructing and repairing their houses, fuel wood as well as forest produce for domestic consumption. Now, modern states' interference in forest affairs disrupt tribal economies that are related to forest, that are dependent on forest producers. Despite the existence of several legislations by the state to secure the tribal rights over forests, in reality one sees that the uniform implementation of such measures is yet to be achieved. The tribal regions are targeted for large-scale industrial projects in the name of national development. Land acquisition laws favored the corporations, thereby causing forced displacements with poor compensation and a loss of the organic or the natural livelihoods. So, when these corporations, these industrial projects are proliferated, are expanded in the tribal areas, those projects are materialized only through displacement of the tribal population from their original or ancestral land, and what they get as a substitute is many times deemed as inadequate or poor substitutes, and the compensatory or the substitute life costs them their organic or their natural livelihoods. So, environmental degradation as a result of industrial activities has severely impacted the tribal economies. Deforestation, water pollution and soil erosion have reduced agricultural productivity and tribal access to forest resources. Resistance movements against corporate encroachment have emerged in various tribal regions, where the tribals actually come out voicing their protests against these corporates, corporate bodies that are encroaching, that are kind of expanding their wings in the tribal lands and increasingly disadvantaging the tribal lives as a result. However, these efforts, these movements, these protest movements face state repression. The tribal voice is often suppressed by the state apparatus. Demand for land rights and environmental protections is often met with legal action, violence and at times arrests of the tribal leaders or the tribal activists. Plantation and construction jobs provide employment, however lacking any kind of stability, thereby making seasonal migration a survival strategy for the tribal population. So, these plantation and construction jobs that are built in their original areas cannot be a perennial or a good stable source of money. So, seasonal migration for cultivation or for some other odd jobs as wage workers tend to become a survival strategy for the tribals. They move to other parts of India looking for alternate jobs, often as laborers, as coolies. So many tribals leave their native regions searching for job, and often they face social and cultural dislocation without any sense of long-term security. Unorganized sector absorbs a large number of tribal workers, but then it lacks job security, social benefits, and the question of fair wage. The question of getting a fair wage is a far cry. Absence of strong trade unions among the tribal populations limits their ability or their agency to demand better working conditions. So, they are not kind of stakeholders, or they are not amply heard voices as far as a equitable working condition and wage is concerned. So, debts and bondage force the tribals to borrow money from landlords and employers at a very high interest, and this has been a traditional case where in a lot of tribal literature we hear the people being exploited by the landlords and the money lenders. These are the two categories of non-tribal people living in tribal areas who have traditionally, historically, very strategically, exploited this population, this already marginalized population. So, what happens is that the tribals tend to borrow from the landlords and employers at a very high interest, which traps them in a perpetual situation of servitude. Exploitative contracts and weak legal protections further make them vulnerable and exposed to an inequitable, an unfair system. Tribals remain one of the most financially excluded communities in India, with limited access to formal banking services as well as credit institutions. Traditional moneylenders therefore come to the scene very often, exploiting this gap of knowledge or this gap of access to banking, to credit institutions, and they offer high interest loans which trap the tribals in cycles of debt and bonded labor. So, financial inclusion programs have had limited success due to lack of awareness, geographic isolation, and stringent eligibility criteria. So, all these things tend to act as counterproductive or work against the advantage or general wellness of the tribal people. Alternative financial models such as community savings groups as well as tribal cooperative banks have shown promise in improving the credit accessibility. With policy support, these models can actually reduce the dependence on exploitative lenders and promote economic sustainability. So, with policy support, these models can reduce dependence on exploitative lenders and promote economic sustainability. In the post-independence period, we see that the various aspects of the 5th and 6th 5-year plans, which are largely known as, or which are largely presented as a ladder of tribal development, have in reality pushed the tribals into dependency. So, while the national, the formal version has it that the 5th and the 6th 5-year plans have have enabled tribal development, have facilitated tribal development. In reality, according to according to the tribal narrative, it has further pushed the tribals into dependency. Bureaucratic inefficiencies as well as corruption have caused the tribal welfare programs to become ineffective. Funds allocated for tribal development are often misused, and the benefits are limited to certain privileged sections, hence these benefits really reach out to the intended recipients who are mostly at the bottommost rung of this ladder of hierarchy. Programs such as the tribal subplan, which are meant to address socioeconomic disadvantages, have often been poorly implemented with little to no accountability and minimal community participation. So these tribal subplans, they are implemented but not to much success. Several government-led programs to integrate the tribals into mainstream economy and development include the fully subsidized education, housing, health facilities, allotment of surplus land as well as subsidies for agricultural development. Despite such policies and efforts of the government, the socioeconomic indicators such as literacy, average area of land per household, the degree of market participation, wage rate and other such factors are on the decline among the scheduled tribal groups or the scheduled tribes. While affirmative or positive action policies such as reservation in education and employment have to some extent benefited the tribals or a section of tribals, these measures have been insufficient in the long run to address the systemic economic marginalization and exclusion of the tribal population. So, as a way of concluding our lecture today, we would see that the economic transformation of tribal societies has been primarily shaped through external forces which prioritize the national development over the tribal communities' general welfare. So, the priorities of these external bodies or external policies is mainly the development of the nation rather than the upliftment of the tribal people themselves. Government policies often claim to support economic upliftment, however in practice they have led to further marginalization, further economic disadvantaging of the tribes. So, there is this requirement for structural reforms of economic policies, otherwise these policies will end up continuing to serve only certain dominant interests rather than uplifting the marginalized communities. The benefits of these policies will just be restricted to the hands of a privileged few. Finally, we can say that the future policy interventions must be community driven, focusing on self-sustaining economic models rather than forced assimilation or a drive for forced assimilation coming from outside of the tribal groups. The role of the state should be to empower and not to displace the tribal communities. So, with this we come to the end of our lecture today. Let's meet with a new discussion in our next lecture. Thank you.